Welcome to Getting Rich Together, the show for successful women who are looking to take their financial futures to the next level. I'm your host, Syama Bunten. When I started my wealth building journey, nobody knocked on my door to give me all the answers. So I want to talk to the experts who've done it and bring the answers to you so we can discover the right opportunities that will help us achieve the financial futures we've always dreamed of, together, and have fun doing it. So let's dive into this episode and start getting rich together. I am here with the incredibly brilliant and beautiful Suze Dowling. Suze, everyone knows you as running the helm of Pattern, an incredible business, bringing together the most incredible home brands, building brands for consumers that they love. I'd be remiss not to mention at the helm of Jin Lane Media, where you were able to maybe cut your teeth on brand. But while today isn't about just your professional successes, though we will get there, I would love to start back when you were a little girl, back when you were in pigtails. Suze Dowling, welcome to Getting Rich Together. And let's jump into your childhood. What a way to start.
I feel like am I about to deep dive into the deepest, darkest therapy session? I'm excited for it. I'm ready for it. The little me was actually, my full name is Susan. So little me was actually little Susan Constance. That was me as a child. And then I grew into Suze. If we're going back all the way to childhood, Susan Constance in her little lead-smelting town.
Where did you grow up? What was family life like around you? Take us back to 7, 9, 12 years old.
I'm originally from Australia. I now feel like I have an accent that no one can quite place, but if you're listening, I'm an Aussie at heart. So I grew up in a blue-collar rural town in South Australia. One of the main industries in my town was lead smelting. That's literally the process of manufacturing lead. Not the most glamorous. That was really the kind of hometown environment. And, as a family unit, my parents actually split up when I was very little. So I was 2. And I was actually raised by my dad as a single dad. That was my childhood, a very small, town. We celebrated when we got a traffic light. That was like an amazing moment. That made the local newspaper. There's like a little ribbon cutting ceremony. The mayor came, traffic light in the main street. But yeah, it was a lead smelting town. While my dad didn't work for the smelters, most people in the area did. My dad was actually self-employed. And so, had always I'd grown up around the world of him in his own way being an entrepreneur.
That is so cool. I feel like there's something about growing up in a place that's small where it's like, when you have big ideas or there's something inside of you, it almost feels like the pressure of being in a small area can sort of have this feeling around you of like, all right, what is there? So what did you think about your father being entrepreneurial, sort of being in this industry focused town? When you were a little girl, what did you dream of being?
Well, I actually thought I was going to become a teacher. Little Susan thought she was going to be a teacher. There was this story that still makes me giggle about how bossy I probably was as a child, and probably still am. I was 3 or 4 years old. My nana and pop were babysitting me. And apparently I sat them down in front of my blackboard, which was one of my favorite things. I loved to draw on the blackboard, right? And I said, let me teach you about all the things you need to know. I was always the smallest kid in school. In school photos, they'd line you up by your height. And I was always the one on the very bottom left. I was always the tiniest, shortest little thing. But I had a bit of a big personality. I never let being in my hometown limit my dreams. I thought I was going to be a teacher, but I always knew somehow that I was not going to be living in my hometown. There was always a part of me that just, dreamed of seeing the world and of living elsewhere, as young as I can remember.
I love that. And so while you were in high school, did you find yourself to be really heads down and in the books? Did Susan become a Suze at that point? Did you have a part-time job? What was going around in your mind as far as coming into yourself?
Susan did become a Suze at that point. My teenage years were really impactful to me. I lived in my hometown until I was 15. I was actually able to get my first job. I think I was maybe 13 and a half. My first job was the most humbling job I've ever had, which was working for the local kebab shop. And I started off as the potato peeler. So I would sit outside in this like tiny little area on an upside down bucket peeling potatoes for them to make chips. I can't tell you how many potatoes I peeled. I was like minimum wage, peeling potatoes, so many potatoes. To this day, I'm a great potato peeler. And then I got to graduate to be the dishwasher. Eventually, I got to graduate to actually flipping the burgers and cutting the kebab meat. I was very proud of myself. It was a meteoric rise to the top at the age of 13, 14. My first paycheck, my dad made me frame. I'm sure he probably gave me the money for his books. I think the first paycheck was something like $60. It was very minimum wage. But he actually forced me to frame it in like a full like artwork that I then had sitting on my desk. And he told me, you work hard for your money and this is a milestone. This is the beginning of your journey of making money.
How incredible, Suze. What a moment to sort of indelibly mark in your mind when you're young. Some things parents say to us that they wish we didn't remember, and then other things they say to us that we remember forever.
My dad is someone, he's unfortunately no longer with us, but he is the person that has left such a mark on my life. He worked for himself, but we actually didn't have much growing up. Scraping by was probably a nice way of putting it. We didn't go on vacations. We didn't have any money to spare. But there was one thing he said that really stuck with me. So growing up, he'd, have his wallet and he'd pull out his wallet and he had $100, bill. And he would always say, as long as I have this, I feel secure. That's been something that's really stuck with me. Even though we didn't have very much, he believed in the importance of having something you would not spend and knowing it was there, giving you that sense of safety. And so that's something that while I don't have $100 bill in my wallet at all times, it is something that's really stuck with me. He's been one of the biggest influences on my life.
Wow. And so as you started earning $60 here and there as a young person, did you find yourself then putting that money in a bank account? Was it, let me put this in cash? These are the things that I now want to pay for myself and afford things for myself that maybe you didn't. How did you first start to think about the initial dollars you were making?
So I'd had a bank account set up for me when I was very little, even though we didn't have very much. We'd put a couple of dollars here and there. Before that, I'd also earned pocket money. I was great at ironing shirts for some pocket money and polishing shoes.
Industrious, Suze.
Very. I've got so many life skills. I'd always had the bank account, and certainly when I first started my first jobs, I was putting the money into the savings. As I got a little older in my teenage years, I was a little rebellious. I was like, why can't I spend this a little bit more? I remember I'd go to Adelaide, which was the big city about 4 hours away. I'd be like, oh, I'm going to go on a shopping spree. And I spent all of the $60. So it was a combination of saving and spending. But honestly, the biggest thing for me that was kind of like a financial impact as a teenager was actually moving out of my hometown. I left my hometown when I was 15 to go to Sydney, which is obviously much bigger city in another state, because I'd actually got a scholarship. I had got a scholarship to a very prestigious private girls' school in Sydney. That I was like oh my gosh, my eyes were, open to what the world could be. Having come from my town to then, it was almost laughable in some ways, like the two ends of the extreme. That was the next turning point where I used some of my savings to be situated and feel great in Sydney and just see a different approach to money than I had ever experienced or knew was out there in my life.
And how did that make you feel? 15 is the special age for a girl. I remember being 15 and you're like, I'm not 18 yet or 19, but I'm not 13. And I'm like trying to figure things out. And now you're getting exposure to things in a way that you never had before. How did it make you feel? What were you thinking about the world at that time?
I think it just opened my eyes to things that I never knew. And I think it also changed the way I thought about money, because I think for so long growing up, it had been more survival. Again, we really didn't have very much. I didn't know, I think, until I moved to Sydney that money could really be leveraged and you could think about it in a different way. You could think about investments. I'd never grown up thinking about investments. In my hometown, the only way that I knew as a young child that you could actually get a lot more money was through luck. Like we would buy lottery tickets or scratch offs. So growing up, you could get lucky and suddenly, whereas I think Sydney taught me, because I was able to see different professions, girls I went to school with, their parents, some were entrepreneurs, some were business people, some were lawyers. And I was able to really see the different ways that you could both make money, and that also money often begets money, but also different attitudes to money. If you haven't grown up with very much money, I think sometimes, and I know for me at least, it meant that I was almost scared to learn about money. I almost didn't feel worthy of learning about it because I didn't have money. For those that had grown up with money, it was a natural part of the conversation. They may have had parents or grandparents that opened them investment accounts that were given to them when they turned 18 as a gift. It really was just a very different way about thinking about things, where it turned money from luck to strategy.
That's so fascinating. And so as you were now in this new environment, heads down in your studies.
I was on scholarship, so I had to keep my heads down in my studies, but I also loved education. For me, education was the opportunity to both learn things, but also I saw it as a way out. I saw it as a way to build something that was greater than perhaps what I had been exposed to. And I'm so thankful for that. I think it must have been really scary for my dad to let his 15-year-old kid move to Sydney. I'm so thankful that he trusted me enough and was able to help support me in that, because it was one of those moments that changed my entire life.
Now that you started to think about university, how did you decide what to put your time and attention into? What did you think were sort of the opportunities ahead?
Even though I was living in Sydney and exposed to these things, there was a part of me that honestly was almost scared to embrace it in full. I actually studied education at uni. It was almost like I was living in this in-between world where I was seeing all of these other things for other people, but I wasn't sure. My degree is actually in education. I studied behavioral and learning difficulties in children and thought I would go into teaching. To pay my way through uni, I nannied. I would stack my classes on one day, and the rest of the days I would be basically nannying. So I nannied for an incredible family. I actually had multiple families I nannied for. Again, I'd nanny into the night. But my main family was these two young children. The baby was 3 months old when I met them. The little boy was 3.5. And I had them 4 days a week, 9 hours a day. It was their mom that was the next big aha moment in their life. Their mom, Julie, had her own PR agency, but because she just had the second baby, she was working from home. I got to know her very well during university. And as I got further along into uni, I was kind of like, I don't know if I actually want to go into teaching. So I ended up doing my degree in 3 years. She, at the end of that, helped me get my first job, which was in celebrity management with a connection of hers. Not long after that, she poached me back from them to work for her in her PR agency. It was another exposure to an amazing woman that was able to do it all and had created her own business, setting the rules of her life.
Wow, how powerful. And also to be young. And obviously, we're pretty impressionable when we're young. And so to see a strong woman who is not only running her own company, but also having a family and figuring out how to, and I say this in air quotes, have it all, because there's so many differing opinions about what that means.
I will say, with having it all, I think you can't have it all at once. I do dream of having it all. It's just how I sequence that out.
Sometimes I wonder if my body could handle having it all at once. Our eyes and our minds are sometimes much larger than what it is we can truly stomach at any one point. I think what's interesting here is PR is a really fascinating industry. I only spent a year of my life in PR. And I have to tell you, it was probably one of the hardest things I ever did. I feel like people really underestimate or undervalue what good publicists do, and also how influential your experience was there, is how it shaped and crafted. Could you double click a little bit on this PR experience?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with you. First of all, with PR, you learn how to take an idea and turn it into a story. The power of story in this world, especially in the world I'm in, of brand building, is so critical. Like, that is one of the key skill sets that people sometimes overlook. You also learn to be the most tenacious, never give up person. It's a grueling job. And for us, that we actually represented a lot of print magazines. So it actually, in some ways, really shaped my career, in that we were working with a lot of print magazines to do their PR for big issues they would have. In America, we call it People Magazine. In Australia, the sister publication was called Who. So we would do all of the PR for their sexiest people issue or most loved XYZ. And, you do all the cover shoots and you'd get buzz and you'd place it on morning television and radio. And I really understand how to think of media as an ecosystem of how do you place a story where and how do you create kind of a different narrative depending on each channel. For me, the big thing was print media. It was declining so rapidly. And that was what really changed. I was working tirelessly. I remember there were days where I'd crawl under my desk and take a nap because I'd been working for so many hours. But it was something where I was like, I don't want to be in an industry that's declining. Why am I doing this? I am young. I am hungry. Why am I sitting here and watching this be something that's just declining while digital media is starting to take off? I really thought about it. I want to be in an industry that's in its infancy, where being young is actually a good thing because no one has decades of experience in this. We're all at the forefront. And for me, that led me to the world of digital media, direct-to-consumer, e-commerce. I made a really tough decision to leave the agency, which for me was very heartbreaking. I'd spent years of my life between nannying and working with Jane in the agency, but I wanted to then move on. So from there, I moved on to a digital media agency in Sydney. That was the beginning of what came next.
My experience working in PR also doesn't pay much. I don't know if it was any different in Australia, but
nothing. I always joke. But you know what? I learned how to scrape a dollar by. I remember there were some times where I'd buy. There's the mashed potato that's not real mashed potato, the dried mashed potato.
Yes.
Water. And sometimes I lived off that with a tin of tuna. And that was what I was surviving on. But this is the scariest thing. So back in the day, there was a leather legging brand that was the sexiest leather leggings ever. I desperately wanted them as my little PR girly. I think they were the equivalent of 1,000 Australian dollars. At that point, I think in total per year, I was maybe making 20,000 Australian dollars. This is 1/20th of my salary. I bought those leggings. I saved enough for them. I bought those leggings and I wore them to death and I felt fabulous in them and I felt powerful. And, I had them for many years, but it was many meals of dried fake mashed potatoes.
I understand.
It's so funny, though, because that's where I think on the outside, a world can seem so glossy. When I was out and about at events, I was wearing my $1,000 leather leggings and 6-inch sky-high heels, living on top of the world. And then I would go home to my tiny little apartment and be eating my mashed potatoes. There's always a contrast. It's never as glossy as it seems on the outside.
As you were making your way to this new industry that was also starting to define itself, I distinctly remember thinking, I think it was back in 2010 or something, I was like, what is this job called community manager? What is this? And I thought it was so interesting how things were just evolving on that landscape, right? And so as you were sort of entering your way into this new digital frontier, did you find, other than it being kind of a wild, wild west and deciding on how things go, did you find yourself negotiating salary for this new industry? Was it more, let me get my feet wet and start to build relationships? How did you look at this first pivot?
I doubled my salary. I think I went from 20,000 to 40,000 in the pivot. It was something where I'd never actually negotiated a salary before that. In PR, you really just... It's not a high paying, or wasn't, at least when I was there, a high paying.
I don't think it still is, Suze.
Starting out, and so there wasn't even a conversation to be had. Whereas in moving into this, I remember thinking how audacious of me to be asking for $40,000. I still actually remember the conversation. These two guys had this digital agency, and I was sitting in their outside deck area. It was kind of hipster cool. We're sitting in the outside deck area and talking about it. I remember thinking oh my gosh, am I going to faint saying this number of here's my expectation? I got what I asked for. In Australia, it's always been a requirement in job postings that they also give a salary guidance. So I had at least some semblance of maybe, I could get the number that I was asking for. But it's still really scary to ask for it for yourself, especially when it's such a big leap.
That number that you asked for, was that on the higher end of what they posted or was it in the middle? Like, how did you?
Middle. It was the
Okay.
middle. And again, this is where I feel like I probably undersold myself. I think sometimes, look, we all, but especially sometimes us as women, don't ask for what we can and should. And I've been guilty of that for many years. As I've gotten older, I've learned to take agency and ask for what is deserved. It's not an easy thing. Sometimes we can undersell or underplay. It's like you hear about people going for jobs, right? And oftentimes women will make the reasons why we're not qualified for something versus actually saying, this is amazing experience that I bring that may be a different perspective that makes me more than qualified for something.
I love that. So this new job really opened up the next stages of your career and of your life. Tell me a little bit about what were some of the dominoes that fell that eventually got you to New York, because you're in New York now, not in Sydney.
It's been 13 years in New York. It was really interesting. I started working for this digital agency. I was on top of the world thinking about how much money I was making. I could actually afford to buy real groceries at that point. I wasn't just living off the mashed potato. It was a life upgrade for me. But it was like anything, I didn't want to get too comfortable. I'd worked there for a year and a half at that point, and I thought about what's next. As an Australian, a lot of Australians move to London. That's a common thing that a lot of Aussies do. We're part of the Commonwealth. And I'd actually never traveled internationally. First, well, I traveled to Bali, but I'd never traveled beyond that. So I'd never been to Europe. I'd never been to America. It was something where I'd always wanted to go. But again, I think it goes back to even the childhood because I didn't take a vacation when I was a child. Like we didn't go on holiday anywhere because we didn't have the money. I didn't really feel comfortable taking a vacation. Even to this day, I still struggle with it a little bit. But I thought, I don't want to get too comfortable here, and it could be interesting to live overseas. I'd grown up watching a lot of overseas television, and so I planned for about 6 months, but I literally decided, why would I waste a vacation going and having a plane ticket and everything? That sounds like a waste of money. I'm just going to move countries. Part of it was because I didn't want to waste money. So it's funny, it's only now actually in having this conversation that I'm sitting there and going, actually, that was part of the reason, in that a plane ticket from Sydney to America is not inexpensive. And again, I had a few $1,000s in savings at that point. It really was one of those things where I was like, okay, I'll move countries. I then thought I'll move to New York because I figured America was harder from a visa situation than the UK for me as an Australian. And then it was really, is it going to be San Francisco or is it going to be New York based on the industry that I was in? New York got it because I wanted to live in a movie set. And I also thought it'd be great to see some snow and it's going to be like an episode of Friends. And so I literally hopped on a plane, having never been to America before. I had stalked probably 1,000 people on cold email. Most people ignored me. A couple wrote back very polite declines. And then one girl who was an Australian over here had said she'd take a coffee with me. So I hopped on a plane being like, I've got a coffee meeting. I arrived on a Friday night and then met her on the Monday morning. And that kind of began the next chapter.
Wow. And so you had a few $1,000s in savings. You were moving everything over. Rent in New York, not cheap. Coffees maybe then were not $10 for a drip cup. Back then, maybe it was 5 or 4. How did you kind of think about financially navigating this transition?
In my mind, I thought if I just really live super scrappily, I can get by for a few months. One of those few $1,000s, I actually prioritized bringing my cat over and spending a portion of that. I spent more on his ticket than I spent on my own. Butter is like the most spoiled little cat. But so that went a portion of my money. I found on Craigslist a room that I went and saw, and I thought it was going to be furnished. When I got there, though, the girl had moved out and taken all of her furniture, and so I quickly learned that was a mistake. So I remember going to the Bed Bath and Beyond and like dragging like an air mattress back with me. I couldn't afford to take the bus. The cat's claws would go into the air mattress and I'd wake up on the floor. It was a disaster, but I was really lucky that, so I arrived on the Friday. I actually, through that girl that I'd emailed, had a coffee with her on the Monday. She was like, this is so funny. I know someone that you should meet. And so she actually texted the person that is now my co-founder of 13 years, Emmett, and she'd met him at a party in the Hamptons. They had kept in touch because she worked in recruitment. And she said, oh, I think you should meet this girl. She's had good experience in Sydney working in digital. Emmett was building his agency, Jin Lane, at the time. It was very early days. And he and I literally met a few hours later. 2 days later, we had a really long conversation about squirrels because I'd never seen a squirrel before, and so I found them fascinating. And then suddenly he was like, we should work together. That has been through multiple companies together. That was the beginning of my entire New York chapter.
Wow. And talk about the serendipity of the universe presenting everything to you on a platter in such short order, Suze. Wow.
I'm such a type A crazy person, but at the same time, I fully believe in fate. I think there are so many moments that I look back on in my life as kind of those sliding door moments. So it could really change the entire course of your life. And I think, how lucky am I that I was able to land on my feet? Also, it meant that I had a job and could then get the apartment, which was its own delightful process in New York. I look back and I go, what would this have been if I actually hadn't met Emmett? Again, so much of my last 13 years, which is a very long time, has been dictated by me cold emailing someone and saying, will you give me some advice? And from there, a whole series of businesses has really been built. It is a little bit wild when you think about it.
And also just a real testament of you doubling down on yourself, which is something that you have continuously done. You've had such incredible accomplishments and life story, and then you get to New York and it feels like that's just the beginning, because what has been happening in New York in your life has been expounding at even more magical rate. So let's keep this story flowing. You meet Emmett, you join Jin Lane. What's so fascinating are the ways in which you guys operated as an agency and some of the opportunities that were really presented to you on a personal level because of the way the business was structured. First of all, did you negotiate with Emmett, or were you like, okay, I need a job and let's go for it? So how did you enter into the partnership? Talk a little bit to me about the structure, your experiences there, and sort of what unfolded.
It's, the thing, Emmett and I make such a great team because we're very different but complementary personalities. It was, I went from 40 to 70, and that was 70,000 American dollars, but it was equivalent to Australian at the time. When I moved over here, it was, basically dollar for dollar parity. And so that was another big jump up where I was like, I am rich. I am so rich. And that was the moment in my mind. But for me, I was always the one that was more of the deal structure. I remember early days of Jin Lane, he would say, okay, well, let's not charge someone this. And I'd be like, no, we're charging them this, and let's scope it out and let's look at it. But for those that don't really know some of Jin Lane's history, so essentially we were a brand agency that became pretty well known for helping to work with entrepreneurs to launch them to market, or if they were already in market, work with them in those very early stages and really grow them in market, mostly with a millennial and direct-to-consumer kind of lens. But what was interesting about our business model, and in part was actually born out of necessity, we took equity in those businesses as well as a cash fee. I still remember vividly, Emmett and I talking about what the value of equity could be in a business. A lot of the time, we had done that in some of the earlier projects because they didn't necessarily have a lot of cash to pay, and equity was what they could broker with. It's funny, I now counsel a lot of founders that are early stage and say, hold on to your equity. It is so precious. Do not pay an agency with equity. Hold on to it because it can be worth 100-fold down the road. Think about every single basis point that you have. That was an incredible journey where we worked with founders of Harry's, Reformation, SweetGreen, Quip, and Hims and Hers. It became, a bit of a, I'd say, legacy upon itself. I think we became well known for, We would always say bet on the jockey, not the horse. And we became known for making some really smart bets on entrepreneurs that went on to build amazing, incredible businesses.
I think it's powerful because to invest in the ecosystem and take a bet on founders and businesses says a lot about not only the founders you're working with, but also your ability to capture trend and to sort of see strategically where the upside might be. I'm sure you and I both know hundreds of people who've taken equity on projects that did not have exits.
It's a game of ratios. Most businesses fail. For a business to even reach 5 years of age is a huge accomplishment and milestone. And so it is something where you're taking a bet and you're hoping that you're making the right bet. And look, in those earlier days of Jin Lane, sometimes we would look at ourselves and be like, are we okay? Because it was hard to make payroll sometimes. I remember chasing people because I needed to get a payment in to then be able to process payroll for everyone less than 24 hours later. I think a lot of people just look to where we ended up, which was a really successful business that, did leave a mark on the world. But I think what people don't see is the years of work behind the scenes where it was really tough. And we never knew if we were actually going to see return on that equity. And in fact, it wasn't until our first exit where we saw some return was the week after we'd fundraised for our next business, Pattern. That was like the first, and we were like, talk about timing. It was also, I got my green card. So it was a very busy week for us.
And so while you're building Jin Lane and as you were sort of increasing in the scope of the business and things were really amplifying, how did things sort of evolve for you on the personal side? Businesses grow, salary gets to grow, maybe more money to do other things with.
It was really interesting where I'd say for many years, I didn't necessarily have more money because so much of that was on paper. We would have equity in businesses, but they hadn't exited and we were still a small agency. And honestly, everything we had, we wanted to put back into the business. So it wasn't actually like I then the next couple of years got to leapfrog through the salary bands as I had almost in some of my earlier years. Because again, it was really us trying to build this new agency business model that could survive on taking equity. But again, that's at a minimum a 5-year bet, if not longer, time horizon. And so you've still got to make do in the meantime. And I think one of my regrets, honestly, financially is so even up until a few years ago, we didn't have a formal company-wide 401k. So when I was at Jin Lane, I didn't have a 401k. And interestingly enough, I didn't actually understand coming from Australia, the importance, because I think Americans, because you don't have a guarantee, like in Australia, you have superannuation. And in addition to your salary, there is a percent that your employer has to legally put into superannuation, no matter how small your salary is. And so I had never grown up in a culture where retirement was feared. And I think that was actually a really interesting lesson for me moving to America, where I didn't almost know how to fear it. I also had to learn the hard way about how to get a credit score. That was really tough. I had to, get a credit card where it was like an $800 limit and it was like a prepaid one and build up a credit score. There's so many things you don't realize when you're moving countries. But I think my big regret is when I didn't have any money living in New York. It's an expensive city. I wish that I had felt more empowered to get a financial manager to talk to me about money, to give me advising on how I should be thinking about it, to say, okay, you don't have this now, but at the next milestone, here's how we're going to strategize together. I wish that I had that confidence. I'd always felt too nervous almost. If I don't have money, I don't want to bother someone with my lack of money for them to manage something that I don't have. But in hindsight, I think that was the time that I needed it the most, the stock market and how to think about using I-bonds and how to do X, Y. There's so many things that I wish, or even telling me how to figure out my credit score, which I had to trial and error. I think that's something where I always tell a lot of other people, even if you don't have very much, educate yourself. Talk to people about this. Is why I'm so excited about this type of conversation. I think we need to talk about it more, but also don't be afraid. Don't be timid. Don't think I don't have enough to do X. Cool, you have $1. Let's figure out what you're going to do with that $1. when you have $10, let's figure out what we're going to do with that. I didn't get a financial manager until we had some Jin Lane exits. And then I finally felt like I had more breathing room and money that I could then deploy into the stock market. I regret that in hindsight.
It's so fascinating. It's also interesting, the confluence of events, mentioning you were knee deep closing your first round of funding, and then things are starting to click in as far as, oh, that was a good decision, how we decided to build this business. And maybe we'd had no idea this would be such a good decision. What were some of the reasons, and how did it unfold that you went, okay, we're going to go from being on the agency side to now we're going to go be on the brand side here, and we're going to go build something that is also very unique and different. It's not common to hear of a startup launching out the gate as being able to operate from a private equity model as its business model. So how did you think about this, and what were some of the ways in which you were ready to move to this next chapter? And I feel confident that this is the right direction.
Whether we were confident or just a little young and naive, I don't know. It's a little bit of both. Look, we had seen and really believed in the power of equity and ownership in a business. Again, this was something where we were working in like the heyday of D2C, where valuations were wild and there's more money from VCs pouring into D2C than you can imagine. And we were seeing, we would obviously get a small piece of equity in these businesses, but we were going, well, if we're already building this brand, we're building the digital storefront, we're building the personality behind the brand, which is how the brand can connect with the human and ultimately drive a sale. Why aren't we doing this for ourselves? It really was one of those conversations. Even through the entirety of Jin Lane, we had always knew that we would do something. The name Pattern has existed since 2013. We just didn't know what it would be. And so we'd explored. We're like, is this going to be something that's a joint venture? Is this going to be, our own fund to invest in things? Because we would see every single deal that was coming through the pipeline. So we're like, we could be investors, we could do this. But then we really settled on, what about if you had this multi-brand concept? Because at the time, so many brands were scaling to 9 figures in revenue, but also were so much in debt and losing so much money where they didn't have a path to profitability. And so we said, what about if you had multiple brands, but instead of scaling one to be huge and then kind of hitting the rising cost of customer acquisition, what about if you had multiple of them, but you just operated as one team? And you kind of scale each brand to its most natural inflection point. So if one brand is 10 million bucks, great. If another is 5 times that, amazing. Let's stop over pressurizing any one brand and diversify risk and reward. Because we were an agency that was used to working across so many clients, the idea of multiple brands felt very normal to us. We know how to do a workflow and look at this and weave this in and out. We went into it with conviction that this was a smarter way to build a business. We evolved actually because in the early days, we thought we were going to be incubating. The move to more true private equity and M&A came actually in 2020 in the midst of COVID, when we were incubating another brand and could no longer travel to the factory. And so much of that incubation process, you want to be there with them as they're, developing the product. Kind of put pen down there and we said, how else can we still grow the brand portfolio? At the time, Amazon aggregators were having their moment in the news. And we said, there's something to that. Quite literally, we Googled, how do I acquire a brand? Thank God for Google. I wish that ChatGPT had been around then. But then we just started telling people, by the way, we're now acquiring brands. We're just going to tell people. And then by April of 21, we had acquired our first brand and had a debt partner to help finance the acquisitions. And now, years later, we've made 6 acquisitions in total.
Wow. So how did you sort of, from a personal side of things, starting something new, starting something in a category that you have a strong value add, right? To be able to really move the needle, but in also many ways, no experience, right? From building a product line and merchandising and dealing with these factories and all of that. What did it look like for you? Was it financial? Was it like, I have enough money in my savings account where I feel secure about this next leap, where the exit's almost close, where you're like, okay, I think this is going to work out well? How did you set yourself up for some stability around this transition?
In some ways, I wish I could say that I had felt super set up for it. I didn't. I'm a person that jumps both feet in, whether right or wrong. And I think it was just, we had such conviction that we needed to do this. The bigger concern for me had been my visa. As someone that wasn't born here, my visa was always tied to my job. My green card came through the week that we'd fundraised for Pattern, but technically Jin Lane still existed for another 6 months. Getting that green card was such a feeling of relief, and I've since got my citizenship. That green card actually, I would say, was more the security that I'd been looking for, because if this were to fail, I was scared that it wouldn't just be my job I would be losing, but it would be my entire life in New York. Getting that green card was that moment of saying, okay, I'm brave enough to do this. Even if this doesn't work out, I will go and figure it out again. I've lived on dried mashed potatoes before. If I need to do that again, I can. But I'm not going to get to be in New York anymore because I have my green card. It's funny how the timing all works out, but I think that actually for me was the unlock, because I didn't grow up with anything. I've always known, worst comes to worst, I will find a way to make ends meet. I will find a way to go and,
peel potatoes. There's, yeah.
Really, it's like, if I, like, whatever I need to do, I will find a way to do that if I need to. And I do believe in betting on yourself. I think I realized a long time ago that a 9-to-5 job is never going to be the thing that makes me the happiest. I love to build a business, and that's what I nerd out on, but it's also not going to be the thing that builds wealth. Building wealth can happen in many different ways. It can happen in investments, property, etc. But it can also happen in betting on yourself, saying, I want to build something of value. And ultimately, that's what we've tried to do with Pattern.
That is a beautiful sentiment. Now, as we're chatting, life is different for you, right? It's like there are a lot of different ways in which you are thinking about your investments, including being at the helm of Pattern, which is a huge investment. So what does it look like for you today as you think about the different, asset classes or vehicles that I feel comfortable in? Are you taking leaps in angel investing? Are you thinking about different ways of investing in the stock market? How engaged are you now with your financial life, and what excites you about it?
I'm definitely engaged in it, and I think I've seen that it can be leveraged. I'm such a believer in the compounding effects of the more money we can get in the market now, think about what this can do for us in the future. I think it's like you see those things as you're scrolling through social media where it's like, if you put $5 in now, look at what it can be from here. I definitely bought into that, where I'm like, okay, let's invest. Some of those Jin Lane exits gave me the ability to be able to feel like I had some money to, put in the market and build from. And again, I think, once you start to build, you then want to build more, right? And so I really think about investing in layers in many, what's my stable long-term foundation? And then what are some of my higher upside bets where I'm like, oh, I can do a sprinkle of this. So, most of my money's in the market. A lot of it is just really tracking the S&P 500 and really, I'm not thinking about it every day. And especially when there's volatility in the market, I'm not looking or just leaving it. I have a finance manager that I work with, and he and his team are amazing. I think that's helpful on a quarterly basis to have strategy sessions of, what are we thinking about? What are we doing here, etc. I also think, small dollars. I'm a big believer in I bonds, especially when inflation's running really hot. I think that's a smart thing. It's not flashy at all, but it's a smart way to preserve some of that value. I think it's also basic things. How do I always make sure I max out my retirement accounts every year? How do I make sure I do a Roth IRA every year? Just like good hygiene and that compounding effect. I do wish I'd learned that maybe a decade ago. It would have been nice. And then it's like a small portion of the portfolio where I see it as higher risk, may never see this money again, but also could get a really high reward of investing. So particularly for me, given my background, that's really angel investments in startups. And for me, I am passionate about consumer and female-led businesses. In my mind, I guess I view that more as, again, bet on the jockey, not the horse. I want to back, people that I believe in. And I know some will work out, maybe. Some may not work out. Most probably won't. But when and if any do, that's really where you can see some of those more sizable returns. And I think for me, it's not just about more money, because at a certain point, I'm also just like, more money is helpful. It gives you financial security, but I really want the freedom. Growing up, for me, money was a little bit opaque and a little bit scary. I didn't feel educated on it. I didn't feel like I knew how to invest or make money. And I just, these days, I just want options. I want the option to not have to actively think about money one day. Ultimately, I also want to, when I have a child one day, give them everything that I didn't have. I want to be able to pay for, their college. I want to be able to help them with, their first home, all of the things that, again, I debate this and I don't yet have a child. But I'm like, would that make them complacent, or is that just giving them a helping start in life? But like, that's my hope.
I'll tell you what, I don't think we can ever escape children from their traumas. So Suze, as we're sort of looking to legacy, you've taken incredible risks on yourself throughout your life. And it sounds like your inner guidance has led you in a very strong way. You are at the beginning of your career in some ways, you're still young, you have a lot more to do. These days, we're all living much longer. As you think about legacy and this body of work that you are embarking on, what might that look like?
Firstly, I'd say I certainly want to live a long time. My Nana made it to maybe 103. I'm hoping we've got some good genes. We've got another
great genes.
Another number of decades left. When I think about legacy, it's less about the money itself or the businesses. It's probably how have I opened the door or inspired someone to make it easier for them to believe they belong in the room. Coming from a small town, I didn't have, money. I didn't have connections. I didn't have a roadmap. No one had really helped me figure it out. And now to be where I am, I still view it as the early stages of all of the things I want to create next. But I hope that someone sees it and goes, well, if she could do that, maybe I can too. I'm very fortunate in that a lot of our business, we've also had venture capital in our business. And so, whereas a lot of my founder friends have bootstrapped, and quite frankly, I am now such a believer of if you can bootstrap or not take institutional capital and own the majority of your cap table, oh my gosh, please do that. But it also has made me really reflect and say, well, I got to actually make a lot of mistakes that we were able to recover from as I learned and grew because we had money in the bank. And you don't necessarily get that luxury as a bootstrapped founder. And so I'm working on a passion project right now, actually, called the D2C Operator, which is basically me writing out and going back to the teaching roots, all of the lessons, the learnings, the templates, the tools that I've kind of learned and created over the last decade plus, so that I can launch that and make that available to founders so they can have those tools, hopefully learn from them. So I think I hope my legacy is helping people bet on themselves.
Yeah. Oh, I just love that so much. And so, Suze, as we wind down, I have two favorite questions that I love to ask. The first is, we talked a lot about saving and investing money. We certainly talked about not having money. We've talked about, all the things, but what we haven't yet talked about is how much fun money can be. So tell me, what are some of your most favorite things to do with your money?
I love to go out and eat and spend probably far too much money on a fabulous restaurant. For me, I'd say there's a couple of things. When I think about what's on the credit card bill, I'd say shoes. I'm very little, and so my clothes have to get tailored, but a shoe doesn't have to get tailored, and so I love shoes. That is I like a nice, expensive shoe. I'm like, yes, please. Buttons, the cat also then likes to be the equivalent of a dog and try and scratch and bite those shoes. But shoes. And then homewares are all about enjoying daily life at home. Ever since I was a little kid, I would buy secondhand home decor magazines because I couldn't afford the brand new ones. I've been obsessed with home since I was a little kid. And so far too many expensive things in the house.
I love that. And then my final question, Suze, is really what you're calling in. Everyone who's listening to this show, we're all fierce advocates and amplifiers of the incredible women who share their stories. What is it you're calling in? How can we support you?
I think it's really with the D2C Operator. I'm creating these playbooks based on my own experiences, but I'm also asking other founder friends or people that might want to be a founder one day, what are the things that they wish they'd know, and what are the playbooks that would be most helpful for them? So I'd say if you're a founder or if you're thinking about starting a company, I'd love to just hear what would be most helpful for you. how can I make the D2C operator really live up to the legacy I want it to have, which is helping you bet on yourself, but also feeling like you have the tools to do so.
I love that. All right, guys, you heard it from Suze. If you're interested in starting a business, you know who to reach out to. Suze, thank you so much for being here today on Getting Rich Together. What an incredible life you have lived so far, and what beautiful gems there are left to unfold. I can't wait to have this conversation in another 5 years.
I will put it on the calendar today. Thank you so much for having me. This has been such a lovely conversation.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Getting Rich Together. Please take a minute to subscribe, and if you like this episode, I'd love it if you could share it with a friend who is ready to elevate their financial future. Until next time, let's keep getting rich together.